Welcome back to the deep dive. We're jumping into a really key period for anyone studying GCSE history here in the UK, America from 1920 right through to 1973.
Yeah, it's a massive slice of history, full of huge changes. We're going to try and pull out the really important stuff for you.
Think of it as understanding what made modern America tick during those incredibly eventful years.
Exactly. We'll look at the major shifts, why they happened, give you a clear overview without drowning you in endless detail.
Okay, so quick overview. We'll kick off with the Roaring Twenties. Loads of economic growth, big social changes.
Yeah.
Sounds exciting, right?
Definitely. But then we'll see how it all came crashing down with the Great Depression. A massive contrast.
And then we'll follow that crucial struggle for civil rights, which really defines so much of the later part of this period, up to 73. Sound good.
Sounds great. Let's dive in.
Right. The 1920s economic boom. First off, what exactly is an economic boom?
Good question. Basically, it's when a country's economy grows really fast. Think more jobs, more money around, generally a feeling that things are improving. And the U.S. definitely had that after World War I.
Okay, so things were looking up. But it wasn't just luck, was it? There were specific reasons for this boom.
Oh, absolutely not luck. It was a whole mix of factors. For starters, you had completely new industries popping up.
Like what kind of things?
Well, cars became huge, radios, household appliances like vacuum cleaners and washing machines, loads of innovation. And crucially, people were investing money in these new ideas.
Ah, so people had money to spend, and they wanted to spend it.
Precisely. Consumer spending just soared. Wages were generally rising for many people, and crucially, access to credit became much easier. You could buy now, pay later.
Like higher purchase.
Exactly. So people bought more stuff, businesses made more stuff to meet demand, hired more workers. It creates this upward cycle. It's actually a really early sign of how consumer desire and credit became central to the American economy.
It's interesting. And what was the government doing while this was happening?
Well, the Republican governments of the 1920s generally took a step back. They favored lower taxes and less government interference in business.
That's the laissez-faire idea, right? Just let business get on with it.
Pretty much. The thinking was that this freedom would encourage businesses to grow and invest, which would benefit everyone in the long run.
Okay, now World War I had only finished a few years earlier. How did a massive war actually help the U.S. economy? Seems a bit counterintuitive.
Yeah, it does. But the U.S. was in a unique spot. Unlike Europe, American factories and land hadn't been destroyed. Plus, America had loaned huge amounts of money to Britain and France during the war.
Ah, so after the war, those countries started paying the money back.
Exactly. That brought a lot of money into the U.S. Also, with European industries struggling to recover, American factories stepped in to sell goods both at home and abroad. They were exporting a lot.
So the U.S. kind of cleaned up while Europe was rebuilding. You mentioned cars earlier. They seem like a really big deal in the 20s.
Oh, massive. Mass production was the key here. Think Henry Ford and the assembly line.
Making things much faster and cheaper.
Yes. Suddenly, cars weren't just for the super rich. More ordinary families could afford one. And that had huge knock-on effects.
Like needing more roads.
Definitely. Massive road building programs kicked off, and it fueled the growth of suburbs. People could live further from their city jobs and just drive in. It completely changed the landscape and how people lived.
Wow. And with all these new products, cars, radios, whatever,
Wow.
how did companies get people to buy them all?
Well, this is where modern advertising really takes off. It became much more sophisticated.
tell.
You had chain stores appearing across the country, mail-order catalogs like Sears Roebuck reaching even remote areas, and just loads of ads, posters, newspapers, radio adverts later on, all trying to persuade you that you needed the latest gadget or car. A real consumer culture was being born.
It sounds like everyone was feeling pretty optimistic.
There was definitely a huge amount of confidence. Confidence in business, confidence in the future. And this spilled over into the stock market.
People started investing more.
Loads of people did. Even people who didn't have much spare cash were tempted to buy shares. There was this belief that prices could only go up.
Risky stuff.
Very risky, especially as many people were buying on the margin, basically. Borrowing money to buy shares, hoping to pay back the loan when the share price rose. A dangerous game if things went wrong.
Okay, so the economy's booming, people have more things. But it wasn't all work and shopping, was it? The Roaring Twenties name suggests a bit more excitement.
Definitely. It was also a time of significant social change and a feeling of greater freedom, especially for some groups. People started questioning old traditions.
And this expressed itself in things like music and dancing.
Absolutely. Jazz music just exploded in popularity. It was energetic, different, and it came with new dances like the Charleston. Very fast, very lively.
Sounds fun. And radio and cinema were big, too.
Hugely popular. They became the main forms of mass entertainment.
Let's dig into those a bit. The car more than just transport.
Oh, yeah. It symbolized freedom, independence. You could just go places you couldn't easily reach before. Weekend trips, visiting relatives. And it created jobs, of course, building the cars, fixing them, building roads, petrol stations.
And radio. Before TV, this was the thing, right?
It really was. Families would gather around the wireless in the evening. You'd get news, music, comedy shows, sports broadcasts.
So it brought entertainment right into the home.
And advertisers loved it. Companies sponsored shows, so it also boosted the economy that way. By the end of the decade, something like 10 million homes had a radio. It was a huge unifying force in a way.
Okay. And jazz, you said it exploded, but it wasn't universally loved, was it?
No, definitely not. It originated in African-American communities, evolving from blues and ragtime. It was exciting, improvisational, and it spread like wildfire thanks to radio and records. Young people, particularly, loved it, and the energetic dances that went with it.
But older people weren't so keen.
Many weren't, no. They saw it as immoral, too wild. They linked it to drinking, smoking, looser behavior, kind of a threat to traditional values.
And there was a racial element, too?
Sadly, yes. A lot of the opposition was purely down to racism. Because jazz had black origins, many white people rejected it. They didn't like the idea of races mixing in jazz clubs either.
So musicians faced difficulties.
Sometimes, yeah. In some places, jazz was banned from public venues, so it often ended up being played in illegal bars called speakeasies, which brings us neatly onto prohibition.
Before we get to speakeasies, cinema. Hollywood's golden age starting.
You could say that. Going to the pictures became a massive pastime. Huge, glamorous cinemas, picture palaces were built.
Pure escapism.
Largely, yes. People could forget their troubles, see movie stars living glamorous lives. You had comedies, westerns, romances. Even the first Mickey Mouse cartoons appeared then. It was incredibly popular.
So lots of cultural changes happening. What about women? The 1920s are famous for the flapper. Was life really changing for women?
It was changing, yes, but perhaps not as much or for as many women as we sometimes think. The biggest legal change was getting the vote in 1920.
The 19th Amendment. More political power.
In theory, yes. But in practice, not many women held political office yet. Socially, the flapper image is strong young women with short hair, shorter skirts, smoking, drinking, going out dancing, challenging those traditional expectations of how women should behave.
A sort of rebellion.
In a way, it represented a desire for more freedom and independence. And economically, more women were working, especially in new office jobs, typists, telephone operators.
But it wasn't all progress.
Definitely not. Women were still paid significantly less than men for the same jobs. Discrimination was common. Most working women were still in low-paid, low-skilled roles.
And the flapper lifestyle wasn't for everyone.
No, that was mainly an urban thing, often more middle class. Women in rural areas or from poorer backgrounds often lived much more traditional lives. So change was happening, but it was uneven and had clear limits.
Right. Important context. Now, prohibition. Banning alcohol nationwide. Why on earth did they do that?
It seems strange now, doesn't it? But there were several reasons pushing for it. A lot of people genuinely believed alcohol was the root of major social problems: poverty, crime, domestic violence.
So moral campaigners.
Yes, strong pressure from religious groups and temperance movements who'd been campaigning against alcohol for decades. They saw drinking as sinful and destructive.
Any other reasons?
Well, World War I played a part. Many big breweries had German names, so boycotting beer was seen as patriotic during the war against Germany. Also, some big industrialists like Henry Ford supported it because they thought sober workers would be more reliable and productive.
And anti-immigrant feelings were mixed in, too.
Unfortunately, yes. Some immigrant groups were associated with heavy drinking, so prohibition tapped into existing prejudices against them. It's a classic case, really, of trying to legislate morality without widespread public buy-in.
And it famously didn't work, did it?
It failed spectacularly. It was meant to reduce crime and improve society, but it arguably did the opposite.
How so?
Well, people didn't stop wanting to drink, so an enormous illegal industry sprang up to supply them bootlegging, making, and selling illegal booze.
And that led to gangsters.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Organized crime syndicates took control of the illegal alcohol trade. Think Al Capone in Chicago. They made fortunes and became incredibly powerful and violent, fighting turf wars.
And the police couldn't stop them.
There was massive corruption. Gangsters bribed police officers, judges, politicians. And it was just impossible to enforce properly. Not enough agents, huge coastlines and borders to patrol, and millions of ordinary people were happy to break the law by having a drink in secret bars, the speakeasies.
So eventually they just gave up.
Pretty much. By 1933, most people realized it was unenforceable and causing more harm than good. So the 18th Amendment, which brought it in, was repealed. A massive policy failure.
Okay, so we've seen the boom, the social changes, the failure of prohibition. But there was a darker side to the 20s, too. Discrimination seems like a big issue. The U.S. is called a melting pot, but it wasn't always welcoming.
That melting pot ideal was always more complicated in reality. For a long time, America had quite open immigration policies. It needed workers, and it presented itself as this land of opportunity.
So loads of people came.
Yes, especially in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Cities became very diverse. Initially, many came from Britain, Ireland, Germany. But from around 1900, more started arriving from Southern and Eastern Europe. Italians, Poles, Russians, Jews.
And this change wasn't welcomed by everyone.
No. After World War I, especially, opposition grew. Some established groups, particularly wealthier white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, loyalists, became worried.
Worried about what?
Fears about immigrants taking jobs, lowering wages, cultural differences causing conflict, putting pressure on housing and schools. A lot of anxiety and prejudice, basically.
And the government responded to these fears.
Yes, by passing laws to restrict immigration. In 1917, they brought in a literacy test. You had to read a short passage in English. They also banned most immigration from Asia and charged an entry fee.
And it got tighter after that.
Much tighter. The 1921 Emergency Quota Act limited numbers from Europe based on how many people from each country were already in the U.S. in 1910. Then the 1924 Reed-Johnson Act cut numbers even further and used the 1890 census figures.
Why use the 1890 figures?
Because that was before the big wave of immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe.
Huh.
So it deliberately discriminated against those groups, favoring immigrants from Northern Europe instead. A very clear attempt to control the ethnic makeup of the country.
Wow. And this fear of outsiders, it connected to feelings about politics too, right? The Red Scare?
Yes, the Red Scare was this intense wave of fear about communism and anarchism sweeping the U.S. right after the Russian Revolution in 1917.
Why were people so scared of communism?
Well, communist ideas, abolishing private property, world revolution seemed like a direct threat to American capitalism, individualism, the whole American dream. And there was a tendency to link these radical ideas with immigrants, especially those from Eastern Europe.
Did anything happen to fuel this fear?
There were some strikes and a few bombings in 1919, which really heightened the panic. The Attorney General, Mitchell Palmer, launched what became known as the Palmer Raids.
What were they?
Federal agents arrested thousands of suspected radicals, socialists, communists, anarchists, often with very little evidence. Many immigrants were deported without proper trials. It was a period of real paranoia.
Was there a specific case that highlighted this?
The Sacco and Vanzetti case is probably the most famous example. Two Italian immigrants, known anarchists, were accused of robbery and murder in 1920.
And did they do it?
It's still debated today. But many people believe their trial was deeply unfair. There was a lot of anti-immigrant and anti-radical prejudice at the time, and even the judge seemed biased against them. They were eventually executed in 1927, despite worldwide protests. It really symbolized the injustice fueled by fear.
A really troubling story. And this discrimination wasn't just against new immigrants, was it? African Americans faced terrible prejudice, especially in the South.
Absolutely. In the southern states, you had the whole system of Jim Crow laws.
What did those involve?
Legal segregation. Separate schools, hospitals, churches, buses, trains, restaurants, water fountains, everything. Black people and white people were forced to live separate lives.
And the ideal was separate but equal.
That was the phrase used to justify it, but it was a total lie. The facilities provided for African Americans were almost always drastically underfunded and inferior. It was all about maintaining white supremacy.
And alongside the laws, there was outright violence.
Yes, particularly from the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK. This white supremacist terrorist group revived in this period and became horrifyingly powerful.
How powerful?
By the mid-1920s, they claimed to have millions of members across the country, not just in the South. They targeted not only African Americans, but also Catholics, Jews, and recent immigrants, anyone they didn't consider a true white Protestant American.
Oh, what did they do?
Violence, intimidation, cross-burnings, beatings, murder, lynchings, mob killings of black people, often by hanging without any trial, were terrifyingly common, especially in the South. And the perpetrators were very rarely brought to justice. Some KKK members even held positions in local and state government.
That's truly shocking. Millions of members. It's hard to comprehend. Did African Americans try to escape this?
Many did. This period saw the continuation of the Great Migration. Millions of African Americans moving from the rural South to cities in the North and Midwest, hoping for better jobs and less overt oppression.
Did they find a better life?
They escaped Jim Crow laws, yes. But they still faced widespread discrimination in the North in housing, in employment, in everyday life. Racism wasn't confined to the South. It just took different forms.
So looking back at the whole decade, it seems the Roaring '20s were roaring for some, but definitely not for others.
That's a crucial point. There was definitely inequality. The winners were often people in the new industries, cars, electricity, chemicals, the urban middle classes, big landowners maybe.
And the losers?
People in older industries like coal mining or textiles often struggled. Many farmers faced a really tough time falling prices after the war, overproduction, debt. Immigrants faced prejudice and restrictive laws, and African Americans were systematically excluded from most of the prosperity due to deep-seated racism. The wealth was not evenly spread at all.
So beneath the surface glamour, there were serious problems brewing.
Absolutely. Those inequalities and underlying economic weaknesses were setting the stage for the disaster that was about to hit.
Right. The Great Depression. It all kicks off with the Wall Street crash in 1929. What actually happened?
Well, remember that stock market speculation we mentioned. People buying shares hoping the price would keep going up, often with borrowed money.
Buying on the margin.
Exactly. By 1929, the market was incredibly inflated. But underneath, the economy wasn't quite as strong as everyone thought. Industries were making more stuff than people could actually buy.
Overproduction.
Yes. And wealth was so unevenly distributed that most ordinary people just didn't have the purchasing power. Plus, the government's laissez-faire approach meant there were few regulations on the stock market, and international trade was hampered by tariffs.
So a house of cards, almost.
In some ways. In late October 1929, some big investors started to get nervous and began selling their shares. This triggered panic. On Black Thursday, October 24th, prices started to plummet as everyone rushed to sell. Things stabilized briefly, but then crashed again even harder the following week.
Total chaos.
Complete chaos.
Yeah.
Millions of shares became worthless overnight. People who'd borrowed money to buy shares were ruined. Fortunes were wiped out.
And this wasn't just a Wall Street problem, was it? It affected the whole country, the whole world even.
Oh, the impact was devastating and spread rapidly. Businesses couldn't get investment and started to fail, leading to mass bankruptcies.
Which meant job losses.
Huge job losses. Unemployment soared. People lost confidence and stopped spending money, which made things even worse for businesses.
What about the banks?
The banking system basically collapsed. People panicked and rushed to withdraw their savings bank runs. But the banks didn't have enough cash because they'd lost money in the crash or made bad loans. Thousands of banks failed, and people lost their life savings.
And it went global.
Yes, because international trade and loans connected economies. The U.S. slump triggered economic downturns across the world. It really was a Great Depression.
And you said the crash was the trigger, but there are deeper reasons why the Depression got so bad and lasted so long.
That's right. The underlying issues were key. Overproduction in factories and farms, the decline of older industries, that unequal distribution of wealth, weak banking regulations, high tariffs restricting trade, and the huge levels of personal and corporate debt. The crash exposed all these weaknesses.
What was the impact like for ordinary people? It must have been horrific.
It was catastrophic for millions.
Yeah.
We mentioned unemployment at its peak. Maybe a quarter of the workforce was jobless. Those who kept their jobs often faced wage cuts.
And farmers, they were already struggling.
It got much worse for them. Crop prices collapsed. Many couldn't afford to pay their mortgages and lost their farms. And then came the Dust Bowl,
What was that?
a terrible environmental disaster in the Great Plains states during the 1930s. Years of drought combined with poor farming practices turned the topsoil to dust, creating massive dust storms, black blizzards that choked the landscape and made farming impossible.
So farmers had to leave.
Thousands were forced off their land, becoming migrant workers searching for jobs elsewhere, famously heading to places like California, often facing terrible conditions and prejudice, like the characters in Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath.
And in the cities?
Businesses closed everywhere. Without unemployment benefits or much government help, people lost their homes. Homelessness rocketed. Makeshift shantytowns sprang up on wasteland. People called them Hoovervilles.
After President Hoover, that sounds like people were blaming him.
They absolutely were. President Herbert Hoover came in just before the crash. He believed in rugged individualism, that people should help themselves, and the government shouldn't intervene too much.
So he didn't do much.
His response was seen as way too slow and insufficient. He resisted calls for direct federal relief to the unemployed, fearing it would create dependency. He did eventually try some measures, like funding public works projects and loaning money to banks and businesses, but it felt like too little, too late.
And the public perception was negative.
Very negative. He seemed out of touch. The Hoovervilles name, Hoover blankets for newspapers used by homeless people, it showed the public anger. And then came the Bonus Army incident.
What happened there?
In 1932, thousands of unemployed World War I veterans marched on Washington, D.C. They wanted early payment of a bonus they'd been promised. Hoover ordered the Army to clear them out.
The Army. Against veterans.
Yes. Troops used tear gas and bayonets, burned their camps. It looked terrible and sealed Hoover's fate politically. People were desperate for change.
And change came in the form of Franklin D. Roosevelt, right, FDR. He won the 1932 election massively. What did he offer?
Roosevelt offered hope and action. He promised a new deal for the American people. He spoke about helping the forgotten man, using the government actively to tackle the Depression.
What kind of things did he promise specifically?
He talked about creating jobs through government schemes, helping farmers and industry get back on their feet, providing direct relief for the poor and unemployed, protecting workers' rights, and even ending prohibition, which was still unpopular.
And he had a different style to Hoover.
Completely different. He seemed confident, optimistic, willing to experiment. He used radio effectively with his fireside chats to talk directly to people. And having overcome polio himself, he projected an image of strength and empathy that resonated with people suffering hardship.
So he gets elected. What were the main aims of this New Deal?
You can remember them as the 3 R's. Relief, immediate help for the needy; recovery, getting the economy moving again; and reform, making changes to prevent a future depression.
And he acted fast. We hear about the 100 days.
Incredibly fast. In his first 100 days in office, there was a whirlwind of new legislation. He tackled the banking crisis immediately, closing banks temporarily and rushing through laws to stabilize them.
What else?
Loads of new agencies were created, often known by their initials, the alphabet agencies. FARA provided direct relief funds. The AAA aimed to help farmers by paying them to produce less, hoping to raise prices. The NRA tried to get industries to agree on fair codes for wages and prices.
Sounds complex.
It was. And there was the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, a huge project to build dams in the Tennessee River Valley, providing electricity, flood control, and jobs to a very poor region. It was a massive burst of government action. It didn't fix everything overnight, of course, but it showed the government was doing something.
Did the New Deal stay the same, or did it evolve?
It definitely evolved. After the initial rush, around 1935, came what's sometimes called the Second New Deal. This tended to focus more on long-term security and support for ordinary citizens.
What kind of programs were in that phase?
Probably the most famous is the Social Security Act of 1935, establishing a national system for old age pensions and unemployment insurance, a real safety net.
A massive change for the U.S.
Huge. There was also the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, which created millions of jobs building roads, schools, airports, even funding arts projects. And the Wagner Act significantly strengthened the rights of workers to form unions and bargain collectively, plus more efforts on housing reform.
It sounds like a fundamental shift in the government's role. But surely not everyone was happy with all this.
No, there was significant opposition. Conservatives, particularly business owners, hated it. They thought it was way too much government interference, too expensive, undermining free enterprise and individual liberty.
Worried about socialism.
Some definitely framed it that way. They disliked the new regulations, the support for unions, and worried Roosevelt was becoming too powerful, like a dictator. They also argued some of the jobs created were pointless make-work schemes and that it made people dependent on the government.
Was there opposition from the other side, too? People who thought it didn't go far enough?
Yes, there were radical critics. Father Coughlin, a popular radio priest, initially supported FDR, but later attacked him for not being tough enough on bankers. Huey Long, a powerful senator from Louisiana, proposed a radical Share Our Wealth plan to heavily tax the rich and guarantee a minimum income for everyone.
So pressure from both sides.
Hmm.
Any legal challenges?
Yes. The Supreme Court was a major obstacle for a while. They struck down some key early New Deal laws, like the NRA and parts of the AAA, ruling that they gave the federal government powers it didn't constitutionally have. FDR even tried a controversial plan to appoint more sympathetic judges, which failed.
Despite all the challenges, did the New Deal achieve positive things?
Oh, definitely. It significantly reformed the banking system and helped restore public confidence. It established the principle of federal responsibility for welfare. The Social Security system is still with us today.
And it helped people directly.
Millions got jobs or direct relief payments, which eased suffering. Areas like the Tennessee Valley were transformed. Workers gained important rights. It fundamentally changed the relationship between the American people and their government.
But it wasn't perfect.
No. For instance, many New Deal programs discriminated against African Americans, especially in the South where local white officials often administered them. Benefits weren't always distributed fairly.
And the big question, did it actually end the Great Depression?
That's still debated by historians. Unemployment remained high throughout the 1930s, never returning to pre-crash levels until the war. So some argue it didn't fully achieve recovery.
But others disagree.
Others argue it provided vital relief, prevented total collapse, and laid the foundations for later growth. Many believe it was really the massive government spending and industrial mobilization for World War II that finally pulled the U.S. out of the Depression.
Right, so a complex legacy. Now, let's shift gears into the post-war era and the struggle for civil rights. This feels like another huge turning point, running from the 50s into the early 70s.
Absolutely crucial. A period of intense struggle, bravery, and ultimately profound change, though often painfully slow. Education was a key battleground.
You mean desegregating schools?
Exactly. The landmark moment was the Supreme Court's decision in Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka in 1954.
What did that decide?
It declared that state laws establishing separate public schools for black and white students were unconstitutional. It overturned the old separate but equal doctrine, saying separate educational facilities were inherently unequal.
A massive victory on paper.
Huge. But putting it into practice faced enormous resistance, especially in the Deep South. Many states dug their heels in, passed laws to resist desegregation. Violence flared up. The KKK saw a resurgence. New white supremacist groups like the White Citizens Councils formed to fight it.
We saw that resistance very clearly with the Little Rock Nine, didn't we?
A defining moment in 1957. 9 black teenagers tried to enroll at the previously all-white Little Rock Central High School in Arkansas.
And the state governor tried to stop them.
Yes, Governor Orville Faubus ordered the Arkansas National Guard to block the students from entering the school. It caused a major crisis.
How was it resolved?
President Eisenhower eventually had to send in federal troops, the 101st Airborne Division, to escort the students into the school and protect them. But even then, they faced horrific abuse and harassment from white students and protesters all year. It showed just how determined the opposition was, but also the federal government's eventual willingness to enforce the law.
Such incredible bravery from those students. Another really pivotal event was the Montgomery bus boycott.
That kicked off in 1955. It started when Rosa Parks, a respected figure in the black community and NAACP member, refused to give up her seat to a white man on a segregated bus in Montgomery, Alabama.
She was arrested.
She was, and that sparked a massive community-wide boycott of the city's buses, organized by the Montgomery Improvement Association, or MIA.
And a young Martin Luther King Jr. emerged as a leader.
Yes, the MIA chose the charismatic young preacher Dr. King as their leader. He advocated for nonviolent resistance inspired by Gandhi. The boycott lasted for over a year, 381 days.
People just walked or organized carpools.
Exactly. It was incredibly well organized and put huge economic pressure on the bus company and city businesses.
And it worked.
Eventually, yes. In 1956, the Supreme Court ruled that segregation on public buses was illegal. It was a major victory. It showed the power of mass, nonviolent action, brought Dr. King to national prominence, and led to the founding of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, to coordinate future protests.
That nonviolent approach became central, didn't it? Like the Greensboro sit-in.
That was in 1960. 4 black college students in Greensboro, North Carolina, sat down at a segregated Woolworth's lunch counter and politely asked to be served.
And they were refused.
Yes, but they stayed there peacefully until the store closed. The next day, more students joined them. The sit-in movement spread like wildfire across the South.
Students just sitting patiently, facing abuse.
Often, yes. They faced insults, threats, sometimes violence, but they remained nonviolent. It was incredibly powerful visually and morally, and hit businesses economically, forcing many lunch counters and other facilities to desegregate.
Dr. King and the SCLC continued these kinds of campaigns. Birmingham, Alabama in 1963 seems like a really critical moment.
Birmingham was known as one of the most rigidly segregated cities in the U.S. The SCLC launched a major campaign there, involving sit-ins, marches, boycotts, deliberately targeting segregation laws.
And the reaction was harsh.
Extremely harsh. The Public Safety Commissioner, Eugene Bull Connor, used police dogs and high-pressure fire hoses against peaceful protesters, including children.
And this was seen across the world.
Yes, the images were broadcast on TV and published globally. It shocked the conscience of the nation and the world. It showed the brutality of segregation in a way words couldn't. King himself was arrested and wrote his famous letter from Birmingham jail, defending the strategy of nonviolent direct action.
Did the violence backfire on the authorities?
Absolutely. It generated huge sympathy for the civil rights movement and put immense pressure on President Kennedy's administration to act on civil rights legislation. Birmingham was a brutal battle, but a strategic victory for the movement.
That pressure contributed to the March on Washington later that year.
Definitely. The March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in August 1963 was a massive demonstration. 250,000 people, black and white, gathered peacefully in front of the Lincoln Memorial.
And that's where King gave his famous speech.
That's right. His I Have a Dream speech became one of the most iconic speeches in American history, eloquently expressing the hopes and demands of the movement. The march further increased pressure for federal action.
Now, while King was advocating nonviolence, there were other important figures with different perspectives, like Malcolm X.
Malcolm X was a hugely influential and often controversial figure. He rose to prominence as a minister in the Nation of Islam.
And his approach differed from King's.
Significantly, he initially criticized the nonviolent approach as ineffective against white supremacy. He advocated for black self-reliance, racial separation, black pride, and self-defense by any means necessary, as he famously put it.
So a more radical message.
Yes. He powerfully articulated the anger and frustration felt by many African Americans, especially in northern cities where racism existed without Jim Crow laws, and progress felt slow. He later broke with the Nation of Islam and moderated some views before his assassination in 1965.
What was his impact?
He was a powerful voice for black empowerment and laid much of the groundwork for the later Black Power movement. He offered an alternative perspective for those disillusioned with the pace of change through nonviolence.
Let's talk about that Black Power movement. What was it about?
It emerged more strongly in the mid to late 1960s. It grew out of frustration with continued inequality, police brutality in northern ghettos, and the feeling that the civil rights movement wasn't addressing those issues quickly enough.
What were its main aims?
Key themes were black pride, celebrating African heritage, self-determination for black communities, and sometimes a rejection of integration in favor of building black political and economic power.
Who were the key figures and groups?
Besides Malcolm X's earlier influence, Stokely Carmichael, who led SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, when it became more militant, popularized the Black Power slogan. The Black Panther Party, founded in Oakland, California, was another prominent group, known for its community programs, but also for advocating armed self-defense.
Were there specific events associated with it?
The March Against Fear in Mississippi in 1966 is where Carmichael first prominently used the Black Power slogan. And the Black Power salute by athletes Tommy Smith and John Carlos at the 1968 Mexico City Olympics became an iconic image.
How is the movement viewed?
It had positive impacts, like fostering black pride and creating valuable community services, like the Black Panthers' free breakfast programs. But its more militant rhetoric and occasional association with violence frightened many white Americans and some older black activists, leading to backlash and negative media portrayals. It was complex.
Despite these different approaches, the overall pressure did lead to major legal changes, didn't it?
Yes, the mid-1960s saw landmark federal legislation. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was huge.
What did it do?
It outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin in public accommodations like restaurants, hotels, schools, and employment. A massive blow against segregation and discrimination.
And then the Voting Rights Act.
The Voting Rights Act of 1965 aimed directly at the disenfranchisement of black voters in the South. It banned literacy tests and other discriminatory practices and allowed federal officials to oversee voter registration in areas with a history of discrimination.
Did it make a difference?
A huge difference. Black voter registration and turnout in the South increased dramatically, And then came the Civil Rights Act of 1968,
What did that cover?
also known as the Fair Housing Act. It banned discrimination in the sale, rental, and financing of housing. These three acts together dismantled the legal structure of Jim Crow.
But laws don't always change attitudes overnight.
Exactly. While legally groundbreaking, these acts didn't end racism or poverty. Enforcement could be patchy, and deep-seated prejudice remained. Frustration continued, leading to urban riots in some cities in the late 60s.
Tragically, Martin Luther King Jr. didn't live to see the longer-term impact. His assassination in 1968 must have been a terrible shock.
It was devastating. He was in Memphis supporting striking sanitation workers when he was shot. It sparked grief and anger, leading to riots in over 100 cities.
What was the impact on the movement?
It was a huge loss of a unifying leader. It arguably helped push the 1968 Civil Rights Act through Congress as a tribute, but it also deepened divisions, with some feeling nonviolence had failed, contributing to the further rise of Black Power ideas.
Such a turbulent time. And beyond civil rights, the 60s and early 70s saw other big social changes, too. We had Kennedy's New Frontier.
Right. John F. Kennedy's presidency, though tragically cut short, brought a sense of youthful energy and idealism. His New Frontier program aimed to tackle poverty, boost education and healthcare, advance civil rights, and promote initiatives like the Peace Corps.
Did he achieve much?
He had some successes, like the Housing Act and establishing the Peace Corps. He introduced a civil rights bill. But major initiatives like Medicare, healthcare for the elderly, stalled in Congress, and the Civil Rights Bill wasn't passed during his lifetime.
Then Lyndon B. Johnson took over after Kennedy's assassination, his Great Society.
Johnson was much more effective at getting legislation through Congress. He used Kennedy's legacy and his own political skill to push through an ambitious agenda he called the Great Society.
What were its goals?
To eliminate poverty and racial injustice. It was hugely ambitious.
What did it achieve?
A lot, actually.
Mhm.
Medicare and Medicaid, health care for the poor, were established. There was major federal funding for education. And crucially, Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 into law.
But it faced criticism.
Yes. Some criticized the huge cost, especially as spending on the Vietnam War increased. Others felt it didn't do enough to solve deep-rooted inner-city problems or created dependency on government aid.
And alongside all this, the women's rights movement was gaining strength too.
Definitely. The second wave of feminism really took off in the 60s and early 70s.
Or fueled it.
Several things. Women were inspired by the gains of the civil rights movement. More women were in higher education in the workforce, but faced inequality. And Betty Friedan's 1963 book, The Feminine Mystique, struck a chord, articulating the dissatisfaction many women felt with traditional domestic roles.
What were some key developments?
Kennedy set up a presidential commission on the status of women, which documented widespread discrimination. Organizations like NW, the National Organization for Women, were founded in 1966 to campaign for legal and economic equality, pushing for things like equal pay and childcare.
And there were more radical groups too.
Yes, the women's liberation movement emerged, often using more confrontational tactics and challenging sexism in all areas of life, focusing on issues like reproductive rights and sexuality.
Was there major legislation like the Equal Rights Amendment?
The ERA, which proposed guaranteeing equal legal rights regardless of sex, was passed by Congress in 1972, but ultimately failed to be ratified by enough states to become part of the Constitution. There was significant opposition, led by figures like Phyllis Schlafly, who argued it would undermine traditional family values.
But there was a big win on reproductive rights.
Yes, the landmark Roe v. Wade Supreme Court decision in 1973 established a woman's constitutional right to have an abortion, at least in the earlier stages of pregnancy, a hugely significant and still highly controversial ruling.
It really highlights how many different struggles for rights and equality were happening simultaneously. Now, just quickly, we touched on World War I's economic impact earlier. What about World War II? How did that change America?
World War II had enormous consequences. Economically, the massive mobilization for war production finally definitively ended the Great Depression. Millions of jobs were created.
And so,
Huge numbers of women entered the workforce, taking jobs in factories and other roles previously held by men, think Rosie the Riveter, although they still faced unequal pay and were often pushed out after the war.
what about African Americans?
Many moved to industrial centers for war jobs and served in the military, albeit mostly in segregated units. This experience raised expectations for equality after the war. The Double V campaign aimed for victory against fascism abroad and victory against racism at home. While discrimination persisted, the war experience was a catalyst for the post-war civil rights movement.
And internationally.
The war completely ended American isolationism. The U.S. emerged as a global superpower, deeply involved in world affairs, setting the stage for the Cold War.
Okay, one last thing before we wrap up. Popular culture during the Depression. Couldn't have been like the Roaring '20s.
Very different vibe. Escapism was key. People needed ways to forget their troubles, at least for a little while.
So things like radio and cinema were still important.
Even more so, perhaps. Radio was free entertainment at home. Cinema offered a couple hours in a different world. Comedies, musicals, glamorous dramas, westerns were all popular. Technicolor started appearing, making films even more vibrant.
What about music?
Jazz and swing music remained hugely popular. Danceable, upbeat music provided an escape. But blues music also expressed the hardship and sorrow many people felt.
Any other forms of escapism?
Comic books really took off, offering cheap entertainment. The first superhero comics, like Superman, emerged in the late 30s. Books ranged from gritty social realism like Steinbeck to sweeping historical romances like Gone with the Wind. Even sports remained popular, offering heroes and distractions. Jesse Owens' success at the 1936 Berlin Olympics was a huge moment of pride.
So culture provided a kind of release valve during those tough times.
Exactly. Reflected the hardships, but also offered hope and distraction.
Right, well, we've covered a huge amount of ground there. Bringing this deep dive to a close, it's so clear that America between 1920 and 1973 went through just incredible transformations, didn't it?
Absolutely. You have the dizzying highs of the boom, the devastating lows of the Depression, the massive upheaval of World War, and then this long, incredibly difficult, but ultimately world-changing struggle for civil rights and social justice.
It really feels like this period forged so much of the United States we see today. Its economy, its social divisions, its political landscape, its place in the world.
It undeniably laid the foundations. The debates and struggles from that era continue to resonate now in so many ways.
Which leaves us with something to think about. How do you think those stark contrasts, the massive prosperity for some alongside real hardship and discrimination for others, how did that mix ultimately shape the American identity and that ongoing search for equality and opportunity that continues today?
That's a great question to ponder. There's certainly no single easy answer.
Definitely something to mull over. And if anything we've talked about today, a specific event, a movement, a person caught your interest, definitely go and explore it further. There's so much more to discover about this fascinating period.